So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panel today. We have my colleague, Harriet Murray-Jones, who's a commercial property partner and head of our energy team at HCR Law. Harriet regularly works with individuals, developers and investors in Wales, South West and across the UK. She has specialist expertise in the energy sector and enjoys the dynamic nature of the industry. So welcome, Harriet.
Hi.
Then we have Nick Proctor, the founder and CEO at Amber. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Nicola. How are you?
Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. So in 2019, seeing that businesses were being overcharged and underserved by their energy consultants, Nick founded Amber to provide a genuine alternative to the market. Fast forward 13 years, he's a member of the UK Green Building Council task force, and Amber has grown into a B Corporation certified company with over 100 employees. Then we have Andrew Walker, the commercial director at Amber. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Nicola. Great to join you.
Thanks for joining us today. So Andrew joined Amber from John Lewis in 2021, having spent 14 years in a wide range of roles, including retail operations, supply chain strategy, new business growth, and financial services commercial leadership. As Amber's commercial director, he supports global brands to strategically achieve their net zero ambitions. So we've got a great panel here today, all really experienced people in the energy market and who really understand what net zero looks like. So what I'd like to do is to start with a question for the whole of the panel, really, and just to say, what would you say to the audience who might be questioning if they're ready for net zero? How do they know if they're ready?
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in, Nick. Actually, I think the big question we always try to ask here actually is, what is net zero? And all that it sounds like something that people would go, it's easy, it's just getting to a point where my amount of carbon I'm using is netted off by something. It's important to step back from that definition a little bit just to understand the bigger context of the problem we're trying to solve. So we're all aware, certainly from COP26 as well, the importance and the paradigm that we're all facing, that we can't just continue to do what we're doing. If everyone did just do that, we wouldn't have a planet that was sustainable to live on. So it's a huge, huge ask. It's a huge thing that we need to deal with. But then when you then think, okay, am I ready then to do something about it? The reason that question's important is because you need to know what question you're looking to answer. And for us, the question really is about trying to get your carbon emissions down as low as possible first, as your main challenge, and then thinking of offsetting as not the get out of jail in any stretch, but something that you can use to then balance things out. If every organization in the world does that and does that well, you can achieve a global net zero emissions, and you can get to a point where global warming stops and the reason we're doing it is achieved. If we were all just to go and try and plant trees and go to offsetting first, there simply isn't enough time, space, possible ways in which we could plant those trees in order to actually get there. So netting isn't the thing we're driving at here. It's a definition to us, and I'm sure it'd be interesting to hear from Harriet as well and AJ in a second around their thoughts around this, but it's around making sure that you stay true to what's right overall for the planet as a definition, as a North Star, in order to get things right, because sure as hell, the legislation will follow that, because that is the principle that we're operating to. And I was going to ask actually Harriet, not to digress at all, but are you seeing legislation gradually catch up or start to direct people into what's right for the planet as well?
I think very slowly now, Nick, that's starting to happen, but I think it will really speed up very quickly from now, actually. And I think to answer Nicola's question, I think my view would be, with what you've said in mind, and actually that focus on legislation and corporate social responsibility, the question is really, can your business afford not to be ready to think about net zero? Because we're finding, and anecdotally we're hearing across the board, it's one of the key questions that people are asking about businesses where they're recruiting. So it matters to people who are joining your business, but it also matters for the business you're doing. So do your suppliers need you to be able to tick certain boxes for them to carry on employing you and your services. So I think the definition is really important, and I think we're all here today because we realise it's a journey we have all got to go on, and the sooner we engage on it, the easier hopefully it will be for us all.
Yeah, I just echo both what Harriet and Nick have said, really, but I think it's not an optional journey. I think the other bit I'd just add is there's a lot of talk about 2025 or 2030 or 2050 and those kind of time bands, but in reality what we're dealing with is an atmosphere that can only cope with so much carbon, and so every year that we don't do anything, we're just making the task harder for ourselves down the line. So actually, although there might be, you might not understand completely what needs to happen to get to net zero, and you might not know how you're going to get rid of the last 30% or 40% or whatever it is, but the sooner we start tackling the things that are staring us in the face, the more time we actually have, and the more time we give the brilliant innovators and technology companies to come up with solutions for the bits that are going to be hard, because there will be some tricky bits. There's no hiding from that, but we kind of owe it to ourselves to start soon and tackle the bits that are kind of obvious.
Really helpful, thank you. So can I pick up with you, Andrew? In terms of stakeholder engagement, why is that really important in the net zero journey, and how do people achieve it successfully?
Well, I think Nicola, is really important because what we've seen is businesses can be quite siloed around some of these things. Even the forward-looking sustainable businesses had a sustainability environmental team, and they were really focused on kind of one aspect. Or they had an energy team, and traditionally Amber worked with a lot of energy experts, and there's lots of talent and expertise there. Or you might have exceptional facilities managers or transport and logistic managers, depending on the sector that you're in. But this is such a complete organizational problem challenge that we've got to solve, that you need everyone. I can't think of something that's involved. Marketing want to know what our position as a brand is. The PR team want to understand what we're putting out there. The legal team will want to understand, but when we're making this commitment or this promise, what are the risks that we're taking by making that statement? And then all the operational teams will be jumping up and down saying, I can't have marketing making a promise that's going to impact my team and my job without knowing if I've got the money, the people, the plan, the resources to be able to do that. So, I think these aren't solutions that a boardroom can solve. They're not solutions that any one team in an organization can solve. And so, our kind of approach really is to say, well, let's start with the data and the facts and get people around that, get to a point of alignment, and then work out within, and whether that's a small company with 10 people, everyone's going to be involved. If it's a big company with 10,000 people, well, you might not need all 10,000 people, but it will impact them all at some point. So getting a comms plan and a strategy is critical, because otherwise you can't achieve the speed of change.
And have you seen stakeholder engagement be quite empowering in terms of organizational change?
Well, I think we can probably all think of brands that have been strong in this space, and it just feels coherent throughout the business. So IKEA are an organization that moved early on some of this stuff, and you see it start to flow through, and you can tell that their product design people are now getting it. And it maybe took a little bit longer because the energy procurement could move first, but because they set a singular goal, the whole organization moved around that. And from our own client base, I think we see that with some of the retailers and things that have got a holistic, joined up sustainability view, rather than saying, well, can we save 10% on our electricity bill? It's not a bad thing to set out and want to say, we'd all like to spend a bit less on electricity, but you've got to join it up into your holistic goal. Otherwise you can end up shooting at each other rather than in the same direction.
Thank you, AJ. And over to Nick. So I know that becoming a B corporation was really important to Amber, and you and I had long discussions about it going through the process. I just wanted you to talk really about what you think that journey's been like for Amber as a business and why you advocate being a B Corp.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and we can touch upon the process of going to be a B Corp in a second, but I think the foundation for it for us was, firstly, we have built our business around the why, and the why being the planet, and having an impact, a positive impact on the planet. I think everyone that comes to work here is expecting of them to have a North Star. And whilst it was weaved into everything that we said and everything that we did, I think it's fair to say that almost every organization is hypocritical in some way without meaning to be. So even if like the purpose of your whole organization is really, really clear, you think everybody knows about it, you can then go and find that everybody's ordered steak from New Zealand for dinner. And you think, how's that happened? Like, we all know we're trying to save the planet, but yet we're sitting down. And actually what you find is that the North Star needs to be really clear, really clean, and then the education needs to come with it. With B Corp, it was the first time that we really said, no, we really mean this. And off the back of that, it enabled us to hold the mirror up across the whole organization and question how we did everything. And it really empowered the organization, in fact, to go, look, there's a charter almost of things here that we should be doing. I can use that as my North Star to make decisions. But even better, the legal part of it, Nick, was when they were saying, oh, you've got to change your articles to reflect your decision-making process so that you are making a balanced decision that incorporates the planet and your purpose and your people at the same time. And I remember discussing that with you, and you were, quite rightly, as someone that needs to guide me on it, to ask me the right questions and say, what does this mean? And, it's going to mean this to your business and all these good things. And I think I remember that quite well, because I was really quite driven on it, Nick, wasn't I? That, no, this is definitely the right thing to do. And I think we were probably quite early maybe in doing that. But what's great now is we're getting the benefits from those employees being empowered and wanting to make the changes themselves. They were just talking in the meeting we just had about the bee team and the beekeepers and the beehive they look after, and just their relationship with the organization and their ability to be empowered to make change has improved a long way. And they've now got this measure of our success from the B score there. And I think what I remind people is what's good for the planet is also good for our business. And so, yes, there can be some intangibles there, but you don't have to look very far to realize that although we might be one of the early adopters that are pushing the line we're pushing is actually the hygiene factor to do business. So what we're doing is we're going out and pushing the mold of what a business should be doing. And what you have to then do to compete with us and other organizations like us is you have to do something about this. You have to kind of find a way to do something in your organization that does something about sustainability. So what's actually happening is the hygiene factor line to do business is getting pushed further and further towards doing something about sustainability, something for the planet. And that's what we're seeing with ESG scores, with bank covenants and so forth, with the rate of debt in terms of the amount you can borrow, the rate you can borrow at, even if getting a house, different mortgage rates. So that hygiene factor, that innovation line is pushing everybody along. So to Harriet's point, you just can't sit there and do nothing. You really, really do have to work out what you're going to do. And that could be B Corp, could be something else. Really depends on the shape and size of your organization, to be honest, Nick.
Thank you.
And I think if I can, Nick, I'm sorry, I just think it's a fine balance, because we're often going in and challenging other companies, and we pride ourselves on being honest when we go in and we see things and we're saying, well, if it was our organization, we would focus and change these things. And we can't come from a place of preaching, because we're not net zero, we're on our own journey. And as Nick said, we're constantly having internal debates going, should we be tougher on ourselves there? Should we be doing this? How do we do that? But it gives you a place to go from to say, listen, I'm going to call you out on what you do. And, no one, as much as we like people to tell us we're doing the right things, you also need independent people that will come in and go, I really think you need to sort that out. And that's going to be a priority, because it will cause you a problem. And we'll sit in the boardroom with directors and say, this process that you have in your organization, and in 6 years' time, that's going to be the biggest problem that you're facing. let's get on and figure out a solution. Right now, no one knows how we're going to solve that. And coming from a place of credibility that says, hey, we're not perfect, but we've made some of the mistakes, and so we can help you avoid some of those things, I think has been really important. As Nick said, there's different ways to achieve it, but the power is that the organization focuses around something to do with the sustainability, and that then drives it. It could be, some of the climate disclosure projects, some of the science-based targets. There's lots of different ways of creating that that catalyst for challenging conversations. For Amber, it's been BCorp for sure. But the important thing is that those conversations are held and engage all levels within the organisation.
Great, thanks AJ. So coming back to Harriet, so for the realities that we need to acknowledge, what are the key considerations that you think people need to keep in mind when they're creating or implementing a net zero strategy?
So I think the really important thing to understand, Nicola, and actually it's really important following on from what Andrew and Nick have just said, is to understand where you are as a business at the start of your journey, but also not be scared by that, because there are so many businesses that think, well, there's so many things I've got to do here, I don't even know where to start. And it probably doesn't matter where you start, as long as you sort of make the decision and then have a true reflection of where you think your baseline is now. And the other encouraging thing to say is that Andrew and Nick and what they've achieved at Amber is really impressive. And not all businesses are going to get there so quickly, and that might not be their right North Star. But actually, there are some quite easy wins that you can make early on that make a really big difference and actually can inspire you to do more. So I think in some ways it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you start, and then just go and speak to someone to really understand what your carbon footprint of a business is, because the reality is it is probably not what you think it is. And so just having an honest analytical look at that, and then having got that, I think you then need to digest it and say, okay, so what works for our business now? Is it that this is the big thing we can achieve and we can do it now? Or should we do these two smaller things with a view to doing this? And just thinking about the scheduling and how, because you still need to run your business, you still need to go out and do that. So it's just making sure you start to build it into your sort of commercial thinking, into your plan. Okay, we've got these 5 things we might do. 3 are really hard, 2 are easy, and just be honest and reflective of where you are. But I think not to be scared. I think it's one of those journeys, and Amber is sort of a really shining star example of that once you start going on it, it can be quite inspiring, and you take people with you, and actually it can be a force for good within the business rather than something you need to have a fear of at this stage.
So I suppose that's a good point. So people can consider it as being maybe continuous incremental change or a journey rather than seismic overnight changes that are going to sidetrack you from running the business as you need to run it.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I don't think it can be a seismic change. I think because you've got to take people with you, because it's no good if you say it and everybody's, you've ticked that box because you've said it. You've actually got to do it. So you've got to take people and the decision makers, but actually all the staff with you. Because if one of the things you could do is print less paper, that's no good if you've told everybody, but everybody's still carrying on doing it. So it's got to be a journey rather than there are some things that might be seismic shifts. You might suddenly stop paying for people's petrol, but it doesn't have to be a seismic shift.
I think the one thing that I always come back to is that the accumulative efforts have to result in a seismic shift, right? So that means that the government's legislation, the red tape around what we can and can't do, grants to encourage heat pumps, changes such as those are to speed up the pace of change. If you're already making the small changes, getting used to the changes, getting people bought into the journey, then as those things come, they become opportunities as opposed to barriers. So the organization gets used to seeing, oh, there must be another grant or something coming because this is obvious and everybody needs to do this, and it's not going to happen otherwise. And sure as hell then you can find that pretty quickly there's something going on in that space that you can get involved in. And it's not always a grant. Sometimes it is legislative changes that are coming in the other way around. There is a bit of carrot and stick in what's going to happen in the UK around pushing us to net zero. But the whole part that we're saying here is that just getting used to that change, knowing where you are, knowing how big the problem might be for your organization is such a big first step, but it actually isn't a huge amount of work because you can outsource getting a carbon footprint measurement and you get your board team together, discuss it. And you find normally that the people you thought weren't passionate about it are the most passionate and have the best ideas. And that's what's so empowering is when you go in the boardroom and you go, should we talk about this? And suddenly like 3 hours later, you're leaving and everyone's talking about what they eat at home, how they travel to work, what the organization takes, where you buy stuff from, and everyone's got all these little mini projects they're happy to go off and do. I mean, yes, you need the address on that then to say, let's come back in a month's time and measure our impact. But boards are used to doing that. So I think if you've got governance in place already, it's just another item that you need to make sure is on the agenda as a standing item, really.
And I think just picking up on Harriet's idea around, paper as a kind of, it's one we can all kind of picture and imagine. There may be situations, but there'll be really few and far between of a company overnight going, right, we're going to ban paper. Well, it's much more about saying, well, actually, let's get the people together who know about the processes that generate paper. Why do we use paper? What are we doing with paper? Why is it valuable to our organization? And part of it is saying, well, paper has a carbon cost now, so we better be really sure that when we're using paper, we absolutely have to. And it's the same with petrol or energy prices at the moment. It brings to front of mind. The energy prices now going, well, we better be sure that we want the heating on because at the moment it's costing us a lot of money, and it's bringing that, and that will drive the sort of 4 or 5% reductions year on year, which is what this is. This is a really long journey, but actually, if you engage people in the right way, there's teams of people who probably, if you said in 3 years' time, could you move away from paper entirely? They'd say yes, but this is what will need to happen in my team in order for that to happen. And then the business is able to build a plan or build a business case or say, oh no, the technology is not ready for that yet. Let's come back to that and let's go after something else. And that's where it can be really empowering and engaging, I think, because we had an internal one recently that Nick was sort of referring to around, should we ban meat or whatever, because we all know the kind of the impact, but it just didn't feel like the right way to engage an organization to overnight come out and go, right, you're allowed chicken but not beef, we've made a new rule, or and it's just not going to achieve the outcome that we want. But it doesn't mean that we're shirking from the fact that consuming meat and the choices that we make as an organization, we need to look at. We just know that the answer's more complicated than ban it totally.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, guys. And I guess I wanted to pose a question to Nick. Can every business have an impact and achieve net zero? Are there any blockers to achieving net zero?
Are there any blockers? It's certainly easier in some industries and a huge amount of work to do in others. I often have conversations with people that say, would you work with this type of organization, being an organization that's driving net zero? Now, I'm relentlessly inclusive in my mindset to this. My thinking is that the organizations that have the worst impacts on the planet are the ones that I can have the biggest impact on, and the ones that we need to put the most focus on. And often the ones which are a long way through their journey, there's less value add, there's less like catalyzing of their change. But big but is that you need the ones which can do it more easily to do it, so that the ones which are going to struggle aren't going to struggle on endlessly, because that's no good for any of us. Because the ultimate netting effect is that we do have some lifelines. We do have carbon capture storage. We have got natural carbon sinks in. So natural carbon sink is like a tree, so it just takes carbon out of the atmosphere. We've got soil that we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere from. So we can use natural carbon sinks. We can use the environment around us in order to essentially make it work as a planet. And our legislation will be based around that science. So I always go back to the science, because legislation will be based on science. So what we're doing is going ticking clock, need to move quickly. Okay, if the organizations that can do this easily do that, then the ones which are left with a lot more to do only need to get to 60%, 50%, whatever it is. But if the organizations that can do it easily don't do their bit, they'd have to go to like 80%. And that's where the big problem is. So we need to reserve as much of the offsetting, as much of the netting effect for the organisations which simply aren't going to be able to overcome the problem. And then I suppose if you are one of those organisations, you need to think about the types of products, the services you offer, and the longevity of those in a new society that really cares about the planet in 2040, and work out how you get from where you are to there. But that's a strategic layer. That's nothing to do with really what we're talking about with net zero. So I'll pass from going into depth there. But I mention it because there's obviously tension between business strategy and sustainability. That there has to be, there has to be good tension there. And that's really what we're talking about, is just introducing that tension into the organization by making it an item that you talk about more regularly.
Great. Thank you, Nick. It's like, so Harriet and I were talking last week with a client about soil carbon. So these conversations are happening now, and people are actually looking at how they can measure that carbon storage and stuff. So it's good to see that. But I was going to ask Harriet a bit more really about what she's seeing in practice. So what changes are happening in the law? What are you seeing on a day-to-day basis in the energy sector?
So I think the really interesting thing we're seeing, Nicola, is a real change in stakeholder. So when I started out being an energy lawyer, the people that were interested were the investors who were running around making sites and setting up projects. But now what you see is the businesses or the landowners looking at doing it differently. So you wouldn't have seen, I don't think, 10 years ago, the sort of things we're seeing now, which is colleges or universities who've got multi-sites trying to do something across campuses with different technologies, trying to create green parks. Doing that for two reasons. One, because their students really care, and two, because they know it's the right thing. Or, for example, local authorities definitely thought it was too scary 10 years ago, but now I don't think there's a local authority in the country who hasn't declared a climate emergency. So you're seeing complete change in the people who are coming in as clients looking at these projects. And for me, that's really good, because it's actually almost ahead of where the legislation is. So we're seeing things like, increased BREEAM legislation, and we're seeing changes to the EPCs and all the, building standards, all that's going through, and that'll continue and it'll pick up a pace. But it's the change of people, I think, is quite inspiring. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is the real change on the focus on infrastructure. So before, it felt like infrastructure was a bit of a blocker, and people were always complaining about grid connection, or, well, it's too difficult, or well, I take this heat. And people are looking at it much more innovatively. So I think for me, that's the real change, which should move things hopefully forward at a pace. And I think you also see, and hopefully Nick and Andrew will be able to back this up anecdotally, people you wouldn't expect to have been interested going, I think I can do something about this, and this is my project, and that's good. People who actually, it is quite difficult, loads of little old buildings in small towns thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm actually going to make this improvement across all my sites. But 5 years ago, they'd just carried on renting it out and not worried about it.
Interesting. So can you talk to us about what a PPA is and how they work?
Yes, shall I start? And then I think probably I'll pass over to Nick and Andrew to say how they think it's changing practice. So a PPA is essentially a long-term contractual arrangement for your energy, generally sort of 10 to 15 years, getting more flexible, and it's a purchase of energy from renewable assets. And initially they were really tended to be used by big energy users and quite complicated documents, but they've got much simpler and much easier for everybody to engage with now. So I don't know whether Andrew, Nick, could probably be the good place for you to talk about the reality.
No, thanks, Harriet. So yeah, we're seeing a massive uptick in interest in PPAs, and I think there's lots of kind of macro reasons why that's happening. So I think historically it was you had to have a kind of a niche reason to want to go and do it, and so it was mainly the energy suppliers going and contracting direct, or really big energy users who could command that. And as a result, they were pretty messy contracts, frankly, and there were all sorts of things, and you had to be quite a savvy buyer to kind of a consumer to be able to sign up for one. I think what's happening is a couple of trends. So one, there's a general acceptance that energy produced by fossil fuels is going to drive the price of energy up over time, partly through carbon pricing and partly through, at the moment, the demand for kind of natural gas and that kind of thing. And what that does is it just improves the business case for renewables. And renewables have been a kind of heartland space for PPAs. And so suddenly there's a commercial value, there's a sustainability value to doing this. So typically what we're seeing is it's now becoming accessible for what we would probably, what the market would term a medium-sized energy consumer. You need a reasonable amount of consumption to make it worth putting the agreement in place. But effectively, whether it's on your site or remote, you agree with a developer or a generator to take a portion of power, often at a fixed rate for a period of time. And so for some businesses right now, particularly with what we're seeing, they're saying, someone will lock my energy price for 10 years or, will index with inflation or something. And it will be zero carbon. And therefore it's great. It's part of their kind of net zero strategy. And one of the things that we're trying to push at Amber is what you described, is bringing different individuals, different organizations together, because I think if we can get there, we will soon. It's bringing together a collection of smaller energy users and saying, well, how do we fractionalize ownership of these PPAs, democratize it, allow more people access to this, because it's a good thing. And then our kind of big ambition is, by driving demand for PPAs, is it drives more renewables onto the grid. And so we just think, we look across our portfolio, there's probably £500 million that our clients are spending on energy every year. Well, if we can direct that towards people who've got planning permission or land or the ability to put down more renewables, then it helps everyone out, because we start to expand the renewable generation capacity. So it just ticks a lot of boxes. And I think what's great at the moment is all the forces are kind of coming together to a place where we think that it's going to work for more and more people.
Great. Thanks, AJ. Did you want to add anything, Nick, on PPAs or?
No, I think it's a great opportunity. It's really an opportunity to go on a bit of a journey, as sort of Harriet mentioned before, where you start by kind of adopting a PPA because it's already built, it's somebody else's, but it's still good. A bit like adopting an animal in a park, it's still a good thing to do. No one thinks it's bad. There's just a few connotations about how much new impact you're having. And so you start with adoption because that's the right thing to do. You've got to go on a journey, and it's unlikely that you're going to go fully to building a zoo, right? When you adopt an animal, it's similar sort of thing. So what you then do after that is you then start to work out how to have a bigger impact. And it is about building interest. When we first did our sort of carbon journey at Amber, we did some carbon offsetting at the start, and we knew it wasn't the solution, but we just said to ourselves, let's just do something this year. Let's just have an impact this year. And with PPAs, it's a similar thing. You get the opportunity to start that journey. The only contradictory thing I'd say to that is just be careful, because as soon as you get into those worlds of adoption, you're not too sure. And this is what isn't good with the analogy of adopting an animal, is when you're all sharing the same one. Because whilst that might be fine for raising money into a park, it isn't good for trying to save the planet, because if we're all just adopting the same piece of kit, then that's not cool. And that's really what the whole Rego mistake was everyone was sort of adopting the same thing, and no one was really getting their own by injecting their money into it. And then it just became really cheap. And what we need to do is make sure that as we see the price of carbon, it's gone above, I think it's trading almost at £100 a ton at the moment, in $100 a ton. We really need to think about there being a price for the carbon that we emit, and that the efforts that we then have on any offsetting or any PPAs, that we really just double check that nothing's too good to be true, the legalities aren't going to set us up for a problem down the line when we're kind of caught out for buying the wrong thing. And that is really tricky, actually. That's becoming a space that's becoming more broken up in terms of where the good players are, where the bad players are. And there isn't something I can point to at this stage that says just use that or just use that standard. you really do need to make sure that before you pull the trigger with your choice of supply and where it's coming from, the PPA, that you really know that that's the right thing to do for your organization, because it's a long time, right? 5, 10, 15 years.
So how do people know whether they've got a greenwashing issue or not? How do they actually differentiate that?
Well, I mean, the honest and perhaps disappointing answer is probably most people on a green tariff aren't really on a green tariff. So last summer there was a stat that 75% of UK households were on a green electricity tariff. But given that the grid is only 45% renewable, then something doesn't add up in that equation. And that was, as Nick said, there were these certificates and they could be sold multiple times, and that was a problem. There are a few suppliers, so Good and Ecotricity were kind of benchmarked, because every time they took on a new customer, they added brand new renewable capacity, and they kept the certificates within a closed loop, so traceable green power. So you do have to dig a bit deeper, and that's where the market's broken. Nick's right, because if you can burn coal and then buy some certificates off someone with a wind farm and say that it's green, then something's kind of gone wrong in that process. So yeah, I think the honest answer is that REGOs are not great, but they were the best of a poor suite of options at the time. But yeah, for a company, it's going to your energy supplier and saying, what's your fuel mix? And they should all publish that. Where does your energy come from? And what are my options to buy from a greener mix? And can you show me the sources coming through? And I think we'll see more consumer and business power advocating.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just jump in there, Andrew, because I agree with everything you've just said, and actually the same applies to offsetting, which is if you're going to start putting money into offsetting, you really need to understand the offsetting scheme you're putting it into. And there's the gold standard and there's not so great. But I think actually what I think is really promising at the moment is you're seeing much greater focus on where the energy really comes from, what the mix really is, in the same and offsetting. So actually, as it becomes more transparent, you do uncover problems like the problems with the people had with the reselling of the REGO. So I think it's not just looking at the first offsetting or the first PPA and going, oh yeah, that works for me. It's actually understanding what you are buying, because there isn't 100% renewable energy here, and I don't suspect we'll ever get there. But the more people actually interrogate where their power is coming from, the more that will come on stream.
So that's we've had a question come in talking about sources of energy and a lack of wind and sun doesn't give enough electricity. What's the answer? Is it tidal? Is it combination? Does anyone?
It's a really valid question. I mean, my answer number one would be we haven't finished building as much wind and solar as we could. So to that degree, we can build more. So I'm borrowing someone else's brain and kind of insight and intelligence here. One of the challenges early on in the way that we incentivized wind and solar development was it was all about maximum output. So all the wind farms are designed to generate loads of electricity on a really windy day, and all the solar farms point south, which is pretty logical. But actually, if you want a more rounded bit of generation, then you need some of your solar facing east and west, and you need some wind farms that built on technologies that can generate at low wind speeds. They won't generate as much through the year, and so they won't tick the kind of commercial box of kind of maximizing shareholder returns, but you will be able to generate more renewables. And you're right, Nicola, the tidal stuff's expensive at the moment, but that will come. That's just technology that will kind of come through. I mean, the planning permission recently on the auction for the seabeds off Scotland, that quadruple, if that's all built out, that will quadruple the amount of wind power off the coast of Scotland. And Scotland's already producing twice as much wind power than it can use domestically. So then kind of 2 or 3 things come in. At the moment, there's a load of electricity generated in Scotland that just gets wasted because the wires aren't big enough to get it down into England where it can be used. So there's a sort of ironic infrastructure problem that we need to solve there. And that's before we get into storage and batteries have come down from about £1,000 a kilowatt hour to £100 a kilowatt hour, and it will keep falling. Green hydrogen. So Charles, send me a note. We could probably spend an hour on what the answer to kind of wind and solar is, but there's lots. But to be frank, you ask a really good question. What happens in the middle of winter on a dark night and the wind's not blowing? We do have some challenges that we don't. It's a bit like we touched on with some organisations, companies. If you're a steelworks, right now there aren't great technological solutions for your industry, but we've just got to make the most of the stuff that does work until we can come up with new stuff.
Thanks, AJ. So I wanted to ask Harriet a little bit around the legislative and fiscal changes that we think are going to come. So if you could crystal ball where we think we're going to be in 5 years' time, will the legislation be playing catch up, which is normally what happens, or do you think that actually, if the government got their act together, they could actually strategically drive that change?
So I think the answer to both is yes, actually, Nicola. I would love it to be the case that the legislation is playing catch up, because that would mean people have taken really, really positive action. That would be great. That would be a seismic shift in the thinking of people across the board. But I think it absolutely requires government action to force some of this. And I think I don't know if it was Andrew or Nick earlier said, it's a bit of a carrot and stick. You need a combination of both. Fiscally, I think things are changing. So Andrew touched on tidal and the recent offshore round in Scotland, and what you used to see people valuing these assets over 20-25 year terms, which meant the return had to be much greater, much quicker for it to be investable. And what you're now seeing is that term being pushed out. And as the term gets pushed out, then those assets like tidal power, which generate a return, but over a much longer period of time, become more viable and more investable. And one of the changes I'd really like to see is a long-term valuing of the asset. So not does it make me my money back in 20 years, but actually what's its contribution over 60 years, 100 years, because suddenly that really changes the energy mix that's financially viable in this country. So I think there's going to be a lot of legislative change. I suspect initially what we'll see is lots of tinkering around the edges, changes to standards here and there a little bit, or broad statements that people aren't sure how to comply with, and there's loads of loopholes, and those will probably get tightened up. So I think we will see legislative change, and I think it'll be a sort of continually evolving picture and probably contradict itself in places. And I really hope that what we do see is business taking a lead and legislation catching up, because that would be a really positive picture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And what I'd also like to ask is, what role do we think the private sector have in supporting the national and international efforts to achieve net zero?
Yeah, I was going to jump in on that one, Nick. As soon as you started saying private sector and impact, I was thinking back to COP26 and my time there, and sort of, on the one hand, how depressing it was listening to drops in commitments from the different governments, particularly at the last parts of it. But it wasn't exactly surprising from the week that we had. And then the complete opposite in the private sector of how excited all these people were about what this meant for their business, how much happier their employees were going to be, how they were going to be able to do EVs for their fleet, and kind of all these things that they were getting excited about, but also these pledges and commitments that they were making. And I think a lot of the global money in the world was committing as a group to, we're going to make these changes. So I think there's that old saying of like, money makes the world go round, and it is a bit of a money might save it as well, because what goes hand in hand with saving the planet is the financial benefits that we've briefly touched on. And it's not an under the surface thing. We actually see it, that it's not dirty to be talking about making money and saving the planet. The two things can come in a nice harmony. And I think that for me is what's exciting, is that the private sector has a huge market opportunity ahead of it, probably the biggest that we've ever seen outside of the tech boom, as a secondary market now to go into. There's a lot of global money that doesn't know what to do with itself, and there's secure returns on renewables. It's like the perfect storm of opportunity. So I'm really excited about it. And I think that's coming through in what we're seeing businesses commit to, and the longer terms that they're willing to look at, the fact that they're even interested in PPAs. It's almost like they're getting some confidence up around, like, let's have a go with this. Then let's not sit on the sidelines. So yeah, I'm personally think it's going to be the private sector that drives this forward.
Great.
And I think there's a sort of a cultural, societal shift that these problems aren't going to be solved in the way that we solved problems in the past. We're going from, we talk a lot about kind of circular economy, but there's something different happening as well as to how businesses interact. And so the whole idea of, we'll wait for the legislation that will push down into big supplier, then into customer, into customer and customer, and we'll push it all the way through. That was the old way of change. And now we're seeing people having to come together and solve things as a collective. So you'll have a landlord who knows they need to do something because their EPC rating isn't great, but can't afford to put the rent up because then they might lose the tenant, but the tenant needs their energy bills to go down. And so actually both have a vested interest in doing something together. And you won't get there through legislative, and the government can't mandate that change. That is, all the tenants coming together and say, well, actually, and then the landlord's got a problem because he's got 3 units on the site, and if you put solar panels on them all and someone moves out and then it's a void, he's paying for something that he's not, how does he get around that? Well, actually, if everyone puts their self-interest to one side temporarily, sits around the table, they could find something that benefits them all, and they actually all get a benefit from, and that's the creative thing. But it's not private sector on its own, and I think Harriet's got some great examples of where private and public sector kind of coming together and being a bit more open to relationships can drive innovation.
Yeah, so we've seen some really nice projects actually over the last couple of years that are exactly that, which are collaborations between private private and public money, which have worked really well, both in terms of infrastructure, or whether it's just delivery of heat to sort of a collection of houses, which has been really good. But the other thing I would say on this, Nicola, is what you tend to see is that the businesses who've made these positive steps, it actually creates opportunities in their business that they hadn't anticipated, whether it's because you get more engaged employees or whether it opens you up to new opportunities. So actually for businesses, I think as more and more businesses do it and you see that actually it creates positive, it's a positive result for the business, everybody else will want to get in on the act. So I think it's one of those virtuous circles actually. And it'll quite quickly be the case that businesses who aren't doing it get left behind because suddenly they don't look very attractive to the best talent coming through, because the best talent coming through wants to know what the business cares about. So I think it's a virtuous circle, and I think private money has to be at the heart of it, but the more we can see collaboration, and I think we will see that. I think the way the funding will come through will be a lot of public lending and private lending to public businesses. So we'll see what happens, but it should be a positive picture. We'll see.
I think it's interesting that the green tech and clean tech market is growing so rapidly. So it would be really interesting to see what the technology sector has to add to the mix, and to try and accelerate some of this change quickly and make it more accessible and make it easier for people to engage with technology. So I don't know whether you've come across any interesting projects in that space, but I think we're certainly seeing more interest from venture capital, private equity in clean tech, green tech. It's a hot space at the moment, predicted to continue to grow.
Yeah, I'll come in there, Nicola. I think it's a really hot space, and actually I think probably in the UK we're not utilising it as much as we could. So you and I were speaking to someone a few weeks ago, had a really interesting project in Africa, which was a really high-tech solution to a problem, which was just being done over mobile phones. And I don't think we would have even tried to do something that simple here, because we would have overcomplicated it from the outset, but that's the only way you could deliver that tech solution in Africa. So that was the way they delivered it. And I think the role of tech will be absolutely huge. And I think if we were perhaps a bit more, I almost think we need to simplify it a bit and just be a bit more open-minded about how tech can help, rather than assume it's got to be really, really complicated, because some of it is as simple as just measuring things on an app. I mean, that isn't the answer to everything, but I think so tech's role is huge, really.
I suppose it does mean, because of the simplicity of some of the solutions, that there's going to be a lot of solutions, and the complexity will be how they all talk to each other and how open they are. Because certainly a lot of the examples we've come across, we've been thinking, but if we use that, will we be able to get it to work with that? And so the more you're sitting there with your kind of whole requirements, the harder it is to try and join all the bits together. So I completely agree that there's some really simple opportunity out there, and there have been some really good inspirational stories, like you say, certainly from Africa, from India, from places where they don't have power, some fascinating solutions, some kind of early adopters of peer-to-peer selling using, you know, grids, that microgrids they've made themselves, and all of those good things. And we've not done that in the UK with our really, really complex system. And so you're right, there's definitely a rethink there. It's going to be really interesting and quite paramount, really, to work out how we join the dots with technology. And I think the ones which come out and help us join the dots are going to flourish in the current market with such a decentralized way of fixing the problem.
Yeah, and we've got company we're talking to at the moment, and they're quite a long way on their journey. So they've done some great stuff, and they've gone out off their own back. They've got quite a big land space and a varied kind of demand, and they can put some floating solar over here. We can do some solar on the roof here. We think we can get a wind turbine there. And then they know that their demand's going to change, and EVs are going to come in, and so they'll need charging infrastructure, and they know what. And they got to a point where they just kind of picked the phone up and said, can you help us map it all out? Because we're not quite sure what order all these things come in. And at the moment, we've got great individual companies helping us they're brilliant at floating solar or rooftop solar or wind or whatever. But actually, someone needs to help us sit in the middle and go, okay, so we'll start with that technology because that makes sense for that. Then this is going to come, and we predict that the EV demand's going to, and that's the map. So sometimes it is absolutely the technology and control, and sometimes it's just having that kind of plan in place, which I know kind of contradicts my opening bit, which was just crack on and do some things. But the two kind of fit together. If you're doing nothing, crack on. You got to a point where you're choosing between some really good options. That's when probably just spending a couple of months pausing, building a plan out, and sequencing things makes good sense.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, so Nick, we've been talking about blockchain technology on, we've looked at a couple of options, and we've talked about interoperability and how you can make it all work. And it is really complex. So, I think it's good to be exploring new technology and new solutions. And I think that has to be the way forward. But you've got to do it sensibly and make sure that the solution is actually deliverable and secure, and it will achieve what you want it to achieve. And it's tested and all that sort of stuff. So it's got to be done properly, as you say. But really interesting. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Before we close, I think we've got 4 minutes left. I just wanted to really quickly ask you all whether you had any final thoughts or recommendations to people who might be on the webinar thinking about NetZero. What would you say to them?
So I think I would say don't pretend you don't have to get on the journey, because one way or the other you're going to have to get on the journey one way or the other. And I think the other thing I say is don't be scared. Start small, make a plan, and see where it takes you. So I think that's what I would say.
Thanks, Harriet.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I'd say, and go for what you're interested in. There's tons of stuff out there. But you'll find a bit that you're interested in, and whatever your role or your area of responsibility or your influence, you can make an impact. And if everyone, basically, in order to hit the kind of 1.5%, we need everyone on the planet to be finding kind of 4 or 5% savings year after year, and that's not vast. if we all do it together. If we don't, then some individuals have to carry a much bigger kind of weight. But equally, if people have got questions that they haven't asked on the Q&A, then you can find our details on the recording, drop us a line, happy to kind of have a go at answering some of those things, because a lot of what we do is trying to help people clarify their understanding and empower them to make those choices.
Thanks, AJ. Nick?
Yeah, I suppose you often hear the negativity around the climate stuff now. So you hear red alert, climate risk, threat. You talk about the threat to buildings, talk about the rising sea levels, and if that asset's going to be worth anything, and all of those things. It's easy just to start having like a risk committee for climate and thinking about what risk does this pose to our business all the time. Now, that might be needed in a large corporate structure, but what we found with most organizations is actually going with the positive energy behind it and going, this is a really big opportunity for our organization to, at the moment, stand out against our peers and to do something that's also going to be driven by our employees, to make them feel better about working for us. And so actually think about the force for good side of things and try and drive the positivity through. And as a sort of rounded answer, you'll end up on that journey then quickly going, oh, we're achieving some of the risk factors, they're going down, legislation's coming, we've got an opportunity for it, because it's not going to go away. So you're going to have to spurt quite a lot of energy at it in some way, either via partnerships or directly, but I can't see it being only use an outside company. Your organization does need to find a way to sheep dip the employees in the changes that you make as well. This isn't just done by an outsourcing requirement or an offsetting requirement. There is a need in an organization just to have someone champion it, get someone who likes this space to champion it. Probably find that there isn't the person you all thought. We've certainly found that you ask who's interested, and the hands that go up are far more than you expect, and you get quite a good choice. So go and ask the question, go and see who's really energized by this and give them an opportunity, because that will certainly get you going and get you off the mark.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. So can I just say a really big thank you to the panel. So thanks, Nick. Thanks, AJ. Thanks, Harriet. Really fascinating and interesting to see your insight. You're all really steeped in this market. You live and breathe this stuff day by day, and it's awesome to get your experience and your thoughts. If anyone has any follow-up, please get in touch. We will be in touch with answers to any questions that have been raised that we couldn't answer today. Thank you for your participation, and very much hope that we've helped you a little bit on your net zero journey and the future, and help save the planet together. So thanks everyone for your time. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.